but I am not going to try that today.
I think that's totally valid. Traveling with multiple screens does not sound like a fun endeavor to me.
Well, the iPad works pretty well for that, actually.
See,
Which I have right here, but
when I think of like external screens, I think of like 27s and 32s.
yeah, that's fair.
iPads don't count. Like that's
Yeah,
just the way it is.
that's fair.
But that's partially because like whenever I do an external screen, like that thing, the whole point of it is to show me a whole bunch of things all at one time. Like this is your one job. Don't screw it up. Like that's kind of my mentality with that. So, yes, even like again with that soundboard thing, I've got a Mac Mini in there that's just like primarily music playback and some monitoring stuff. It's like, well, I've got a 24-inch ultra high def monitor that we're going to spin into portrait mode, and we'll use that to manage like different players and like what slide are we on and what's our countdowns and all that stuff. At any given point, I can glance over and see where we're at in the service, what's coming up, how much time do we have down to the second, all those things. So that's the way it goes. Screen real estate. It's the name of the game.
Yeah. Okay, I need to add in here, by the way.
I got some of it cleaned up for you. I noticed you were trying to get stuff done, but internet
the
stuff.
outline?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate that. Oh yeah, I need a new book. I had it and now I forgot it. What was it? Oops. Thank you for the blurb, by the way.
Is that what you're looking for?
Perfect.
I was not certain if you got it, but I figured you would let me know if it was a problem. But
all right,
it is 100% true. There is literally no other contact on my phone that I text about Obsidian. Zero. Just to be completely clear, it is 100% honest right there. And I even pulled up the contacts on my phone to get the number. Like it is exactly the number of contacts on my phone at this moment in time. So
that's cool.
Just so you're aware, there is zero made up on that.
I'll take it. I'll take it. Yeah, I added it to the website. I wordsmithed it a little bit, and I linked for your name. I put Joe Bulig, podcaster and blogger. So I linked to Bookworm and to your site. But if you want anything else on there, let me know.
It's perfectly fine.
Cool. All right. I think I'm good. Wow, you have significantly less action items than I do.
I am putting them in right now, so that there is that.
Yeah, so sorry about the Zoom thing too. I completely forgot. I had linked that to the day job one, so I didn't have to log in and out all the time, but I don't have a day job anymore.
Party time. No, it's minor. I just grabbed the number and slipped it into the system over there that way.
All right.
I just set it up to where it's because that profile has like nothing on it. So I just set it up to where it's a shortcut, and then I don't have to, I just click it when we're ready. That's all I ever do. So unless you change the thing, the meeting ID, it'll just work. That's what I know. Because,
all right,
as we say around here, Joe is lazy.
Well, all right. Pause that. Pop out the chat.
Where's the other one? I had another one. I had 3. What's the other one?
Okay.
I will find it when we go through here.
There's Notions. Make that full page.
I find it frustrating when I know I have 3 action items and I'm looking through my notes and can't find the third one. Because I always write at the bottom like how many action items are there, and I don't see it. I'll find it when we go through here.
All right. Okay, Zoom.
Check, 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 check.
Right.
Also, fun things you do when you put in new soundboards, you have to play with all the new effects racks that come with it.
Well, obviously.
And I, just for fun, set up a delay on it that was set just right to where I could sing around with myself in the microphone.
Okay.
So I was singing "Row, row, row your boat" with myself in a round 3 times over. It was very fun.
Nice.
Nobody thought it was that spectacular. It's like, what's the matter? You don't like my singing? And they're like, actually, no, we don't. Like, well, that's fair. I'm not a singer. Like, that's why I run the soundboard, because you don't want me on the other side of the microphone. This is how it works.
All right. Think.
Oh, I didn't do this thing.
Hold on
Hold on 2 seconds.
Try this.
I don't
want to try this. Talk, talk, talk.
Speak, speech, speak.
Is it working for you?
It sounds the same to me. Is it
Okay.
supposed to sound different?
Well, I had to rejigger my audio hijack recipe, so
rejigger. I like that word.
So it seems to be working. We'll take it.
Also, my apologies. Right. I just downed like 4 chocolate-covered espresso beans, so that was maybe a bad idea. But here we are.
No, that was a great idea. This is going to be awesome.
Maybe that's why I'm full of all these comebacks here recently.
Oh, all right, let's record a podcast before anything else can go wrong.
Okay, sounds fun. All right, I'm good when you are.
I'm gonna be in the game now. I'm not gonna be in the gap as we record this episode.
We are currently better than no internet territory, so there you go.
Exactly. That's a gain.
All right. I just got to drop a marker, so tell me when you're ready.
All right. 3, 2, 1. So I made a thing, Joe Bulig.
Cool. What did you make?
I made a website for a cohort that I will be leading on Obsidian. And it is called Obsidian University, and you have given me a testimonial, so thank you very much for that.
Very excited about this, actually. I'm there are very few of these types of things that I get super stoked about. One that you've done recently is this life theme cohort, which I'm a little behind on, and I'm planning to get caught up in the next day. And 2, when you told me you were going to start this, I thought, that is awesome. I have to go through this because my Obsidian game, although I take borderline full credit for trying to get you, or for getting you onto Obsidian over Rome, like I'll take full credit for that. I know I don't get full credit for that, but I'll take it just because I want it. But I know that like you are the person I go to when it comes to Obsidian, so I definitely need some help in upping my Obsidian game at this point. So I'm glad that you are the person that gets to do that. So I'm hopeful that going through this cohort will help me do that. So I'm very, very, very excited that you're doing this.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, the genesis behind this, I guess, for full disclosure, I don't think we've really talked in detail about it, but I have left the day job. I am now a full-time indie creator. I'm going to try to do a couple other things to like some business consulting and things like that. But primarily the focus here is on having more time to create things. And so don't have the day job to pay the bills anymore. Was thinking through what are the things that I've kind of always wanted to do. Well, one of the things I've always wanted to do was to go through a cohort on Obsidian. I lacked the confidence to do a cohort until I started doing this live theme cohort, which has been going really, really well. But yeah, Obsidian is my jam. I love it. It's my favorite app of all time. And I've done webinars before on Obsidian. I've even made courses on Obsidian previously, but never been able to go deep in like a done with you format, which is what this cohort is intended to be. I spun up a website last week, which, by the way, can you tell what platform that website is?
No. Should I?
I don't know. I just shared it with a couple other people, and they're like, "Oh, is that WordPress? Oh, is that fill in the blank?" And it's Squarespace.
was gonna say I
So
didn't look at it that close when I saw it, so I don't remember. See, I would have guessed WordPress on this, but yeah, go
it
Squarespace.
looks pretty good, eh?
I like this.
Yeah. So Squarespace should sponsor Bookworm, but they haven't yet.
Well, there's that.
But it's cool. It's a really great platform, and they have like this block editor now, so I was able to tweak all the different sections, and there are all the details on that webpage, obsidianuniversity.com. The big thing you need to know is that it's going to have 8 different live sessions, and it's going to take 4 weeks. So I'm going to do 2 live sessions a week plus an office hours, probably Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And there'll be 8 sessions, so 2 sessions per week, starting from first time you've run Obsidian. Here's the settings that you should enable, which Obsidian has come a long way. It's version 1.3 now, I believe. They've got the canvas feature. Like, they keep adding stuff to it all the time. So there's a lot of stuff in there that has changed in the last several months, but giving you the foundation, and then from there just adding on like different workflows and things like that, culminating with some of my crazy nerdy workflows like the Bible study in Obsidian, which where I've got not only the cross-reference library, but I've got like linked to the Greek and Hebrew, uh, all the original words, so you can like do word studies in Obsidian. It's kind of nuts. So all of that is going to happen starting June 12th, and the cost is going to be $247, which I think is pretty fair for 8 group coaching sessions and then 4 office hours. There's a separate circle community that I spun up for this. Really, really excited about it. So if you want to come nerd out about Obsidian with me, please come check it out. This is my first real big venture since going indie. I call the life theme cohort kind of an experiment, but this is the one where like I could see myself doing this forever. Like, if I was going to pick an identity for myself online, I'd love to be the Obsidian guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a lot of respect for people who use Obsidian in different ways, like Nick Milo, for example, linking your thinking, but he's more conceptual. He's the idea-verse guy, and it's all about like the way that you interact with your notes. I want to give people like practical wins on like, here's this crazy application, which you opened it, probably were like, nope, too complicated for me, closed it. At least that's what I did the first time.
Yep.
And you just need someone to kind of show you the ropes and get your system off the ground so it can start contributing to your productivity and creativity workflows. So that's the goal.
I remember I was listening to a podcast. I think it was Mac Power Users. Dr. Drang was on, and he made the comment. Somebody asked him if he had tried Obsidian, and he said that he downloaded it once, opened it, and went, ugh, and promptly uninstalled it. And from there on, he decided that that was not his thing, which is classic Dr. Drang, right? Like that he always wants to build his own thing. That's not really most people's style. Like, using an existing tool is usually what people are going to do. They're not going to go code their own thing. The beauty of something like Obsidian is like you can really make it your own tool, which is why something like this is so helpful. So yeah, I think this will go well. I'm really, really excited about it for you, Mike, and also for myself. So there's that. A little bit of selfishness there involved.
Awesome. Well, should we get into follow up? We've got a couple different action items here. Mine was already completed by the time we ended recording last episode, which was to consider joining the Farnham Street membership. I did that. It's pretty cool. They've got some courses that they've recorded, including one on reading books. But the courses are not the reason, I think, to join that thing. The courses are actually fairly old. You can kind of tell some of them are several years old at this point, and the material is still pretty good. But really, I wanted to be able to get access to some of the members. They've got like a discourse forum, and I know they're working on this like homeschool curriculum, so they had additional details in there for members, which I wanted to get access to, but haven't had a whole lot of time to explore the depths of the membership. Seems pretty cool though. I think I probably would recommend it if you are interested in it, but don't sign up for it because you heard somebody talking about it. You'll look at the page and you'll either feel like, oh yeah, that's exactly what I am looking for, or I'm not so sure about this. If you're not so sure about it, don't do it. But it is basically what it says on the tin. It's more Farnham Street and better.
which you really can't go wrong with. Like even just their base stuff is pretty top notch, so you can't go wrong with them. I don't
Yep.
mind, but that's me.
Exactly.
Yeah, so
How about you?
Yeah, I had one, which is to start writing some blog posts again. I actually have 3 written, one of which is scheduled to go out this Thursday, and I'm going to kind of release those on a Thursday schedule. So first one's kind of like classic Joe. Like this is simplicity and task management. That's kind of what I need to start with just to kind of get the blog post thing rolling. But then I'm kind of working my way into more of these, like, how do you use tech at a church scenario, because that's the world I live in. And I'm learning that as I tour other churches and I try to figure out like how are other churches using tech at the scale at which I'm using it and slightly under or slightly above, just learning that I have a really weird perspective on it and that it's one that I'm trying to get out there a little bit more. Like, how do I use tech in a way that helps people sing on a Sunday morning during the songs versus just watch a performance? So like I have a lot of that mentality, but I haven't really found many other people who do. So I'm trying to like, okay, well, let's write about this and maybe we'll find this crowd in the process. So that's kind of where I'm starting with this. We'll see where it lands. We'll see what happens from there. But that's the blogging world that I'm heading down. We'll see where it lands this time.
Cool.
Super
I'm
fun.
also going to be joining you on this action item, though not related to the book, but I have been doing a little bit of research just around like topic ideas and things like that. And I'm excited to get back into writing consistently as well. I feel like writing is a great complement to the speaking that happens on a podcast.
There is that, yeah.
It's not. I think maybe the tendency is to think, well, I'll pick one or the other. I would encourage people to do both because it comes out different via audio than it does when I have time to sit down and think about what I'm going to write. So I'm excited to read your blog posts.
That'll be fun. I hope. We'll see.
All right. Well, let's talk about today's book, which is The Gap and the Gain by Dr. Benjamin Hardy and Dan Sullivan. I have brought up this concept, I feel, many times on not just Bookworm, but other podcasts and newsletters. And it's just one of those things that seems to bubble up in a lot of different conversations that I have. And it's an idea that was created by Dan Sullivan. He's the creator of Strategic Coach. And it's been around for a while. However, in the last year or so, I think he got together with Dr. Benjamin Hardy, who also helped him put together a book. I think it's called Who Not How. So basically, Dr. Benjamin Hardy has become Dan Sullivan's writing buddy. And it's kind of like a partnership to help create these Bookworm style books from these concepts that Dan has taught for a long time. And he has had like these little self-published leaflet, booklet type things on these different ideas. But this was the first time I've seen The Gap and the Gain in an actual printed, hardcover format, like a lot of the other books that we read. Now, going into this, I have to admit, this is a very short 170 pages. There is definitely an opportunity here to judge this as well. This could have been just a blog post because there's a whole bunch of like single pages with single quotes on them, because Dr. Ben Hardy is the one who's writing this, but Dan Sullivan is the one with the idea. So basically those pages with those quotes, those come from conversations about this topic with Dan Sullivan. And I will say before we get into the book itself, that this is one that I would actually recommend that people check out on Audible, because the Audible version of this, after each chapter, has basically like a 15-20 minute, maybe that's too long, I don't know, but there's like these informal podcast episodes where Dr. Ben Hardy and Dan Sullivan are sitting there having like a a conversation over coffee about the concepts from the chapter. So you get a whole bunch more context. And honestly, that's where some of the really great stuff comes, is when Dan Sullivan is just kind of talking. But what was your first impressions of this book and ultimately this idea?
So I'm kind of new to the idea of the gap and the gain. As I learned about the difference between those two different mental models of sorts, I guess I would use that term. Uh, I I realized that this is something like I've thought this way with the gap mentality for a while in a lot of arenas, but I also sometimes will step out of that and think with this gain mentality. So once I understood like what is he referring to by the gap and the gain, uh, my next question was, okay, if that's the entire book, what's the rest of the book gonna hold? So like the blog post thing you were talking about, like it's almost where you could say, yeah, you could probably do this in a blog post. You write like a 2,000 word blog post and you could probably get this there. I don't know that that really would do the topic justice though, because I feel like this is a big enough idea that it warrants putting a book around it, even though there are a lot of, I don't want to say filler because that's not the right word. There's a lot of like detail put around subtopics for those that helps put a lot of meat behind the ideas. So this might be a weird case where, yeah, this probably could have been a blog post, but I'm not sure I would want it in that format. If I had a blog post sent to me that was called The Gap and the Gain, and I understood like roughly what that was, read the whole blog post, I don't think it would have the impact that an entire book like this would have. So I don't know how I feel about that, because I normally don't like it when people do a book that could have been a blog post. So I'm a little bit torn in that regard.
Well, it can and it can't be done as a blog post, I feel. It can be done as a blog post in that you can get the gist of the idea in probably a package of about 2,000 words. However, you're not getting the real value of the idea without diving deep into it. And that's exactly what Dr. Benjamin Hardy has done here. I'm not sure if you looked at the back of the book with all of the references.
The ridiculous
There's
number of references.
a ridiculous number of references, right? And so that's really what I feel validates a lot of the ideas in here. And if you just lose all that context, it's just something somebody said, and it loses some of the punch, I guess. So I actually am very glad that this format exists, but I think people need to understand that going into it, there will be the opportunity to be like, oh, well, they're just extending this. But honestly, I think it's actually not nearly as long as it could have been. A lot of the references, for example, he'll have a single sentence and he'll have 3 different references of studies that support that statement. Whereas maybe other books that we have read, they'll talk about that for the next several pages, trying to summarize everything that those studies said. So I feel like it's, in terms of the number of words, it's a pretty quick read, but that is actually the author doing the job of condensing it down for us, which I honestly, I wish more books that we read took that approach.
Yeah, I just glanced. There's 40-ish, 42 pages at the back of the book, which are all endnotes, references, index, and the like. So the book itself is 172 pages with 40 some pages at the back after that to cite things and such. So yeah, he definitely covered his tail as far as like, here's where this came from. So good job. Well done, Mr. Hardy.
All right. So maybe let's start here by going into the introduction. And I guess I should kind of preface this. There's 2 different parts to this book. There's an introduction before the first part. Part 1 is get out of the gap. Part 2 is get into the gain. And then there's a short conclusion at the end. So only 2 parts, not 3, which is kind of refreshing because it's right there in the title, the gap and the gain. There's really no need for a third part. You probably could spin one up. if you really, really wanted to, but that's not the approach that
You
they
could
took.
have, I guess, done the gap, the gain, and then getting from one to the other. Like you could have done maybe some of that, but he kind of does it all in the two. So yes.
Yeah, there are opportunities here to extend this for sure, but they did not take that approach. In fact, the real concept of the gap and the gain really comes through in this introductory section. There's a visual here where it talks about your brain, and I'll try to describe this via podcast and audio, but it's not going to be effective. So basically, there are two approaches we can take to things. And one is to look at where we are right now. So imagine a dot like right in the middle of the screen, right? And then on a vertical axis, you compare that to your ideal, which is above that dot. And that results in you always looking at how far you have to go. And this is the problem with goals, is that when you are striving for a goal, you never can get there fast enough. You can never do it good enough. Before long, you get frustrated at the lack of progress that you're making. You're noticing all the things that are going wrong and getting in your way, and that creates what's known as the gap. And he says the other way to do this is to take where you're currently at and measure backwards, look at, where you're at versus where you started. And obviously what that does is it helps you to recognize the growth that has occurred and the progress that you have already made. And when you look backwards like that, when you try to measure your progress, you get excited about, hey, this is actually working, even though I don't see it happening moment to moment or day to day. So it creates this motivation to keep going. And this is definitely the better approach of the two. However, this is not a knowledge problem, and you can't just decide, I am going to now live in the gain instead of the gap. In fact, in the audio from the Audible version, I remember one of those like podcast interviews sections. Dr. Benjamin Hardy asked Dan Sullivan, like, so how often do you fall into the gap? He's like, oh, every single day, multiple times a day. He's like, I do it all the time, but I'm getting really good at recognizing when it happens, and then I flip the switch and I go back. And that's really the value here. I think the recognizing these two things is really important, because in this first section, he kind of talks about how only 14% of American adults say that they are very happy. And he kind of starts with this quote by Thomas Jefferson about how we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But just by saying that we're going to be pursuing happiness, we're implying that we don't have it. And when you're chasing happiness externally, it's because you're disconnected internally and you're trying to fill that gap. He also talks about how high achievers are particularly prone to be in the gap, and everything in life happens for you, not to you. So a couple of like really important perspective changes here, coupled with this idea of hedonic adaptation, which is where we're never satisfied with what we get because we get used to it quickly. The goalposts keep moving. As soon as we get somewhere, we feel like there's somewhere else we should be.
This is where like a lot of light bulbs clicked for me. Obviously, it's the introduction. He's kind of explaining the difference between the gap and the gain, but I hadn't really considered the detriments of like the scale of the detriments of constantly looking at what you're trying to achieve and measuring between where I'm at now and that spot. Like it never really occurred to me that that's a negative or could be a negative till he started explaining this. And by the end of the introduction, then I'm like, huh, apparently I do that a lot, because I constantly see the stuff that I have not accomplished that I want to accomplish, and then by proxy, all the things that I need to do that I continue to not do, that I have to achieve in order to get the goal that I'm trying to work towards. So maybe that's the bad word to use, the goal term, but I just find that the the picture that you can see in your brain of like where I'm at now, where I want to be, and then if you're constantly looking at that, instead of seeing like all the steps to get there, which you may do, but you tend to see like all the shortcomings that you have and that would be preventing you from achieving that. Whereas if you're looking at, say, yesterday, are you better off today than you were yesterday? Have you gotten closer to that ideal versus yesterday? Like if I think about last year and how I was handling myself at work and how I was able to help the people who have events going on at the church, like I'm considerably better at that now than I was just a year ago. But I really only see how the event that I've got coming up in a week, I don't have all the stuff I need to get there, so I don't feel like I'm adequate to run that. Like that's what I see versus if I'd been asked to do this a year ago, this could have been a real bad ordeal. But now it's actually feasible. I'm just shy of that. So like little things like that, you wouldn't think that that's a big deal, but if you're constantly seeing where you're short, like I can see, especially now that I've read this, I can definitely see where that can lead to long-term effects that are just not pleasant. So this was very eye-opening, and I think a really good place to start with this.
Well, let's talk about the needs that you brought up there, because that is addressed in the first chapter. So as I mentioned, the first part is get out of the gap. The first chapter is embrace the freedom of wants. And the core idea there is to recognize that everything that you're striving for is a want, not a need. He defines a need as unresolved internal pain. And on the surface, I think there's a lot of narrative in the productivity space, which would kind of say, like, that's not the way to do it. If you don't really want something enough, if you don't believe in it enough, if you don't need it, then you're not going to put in the effort in order to get it. And this is where right away the book starts to get really interesting for me, because page 9 he talks about Naval Ravikant. So great timing picking that one right before this.
Yep.
But the idea there is that success is and life really is a single player game. You're not competing against anybody else but yourself. And so you got to ask yourself, what do you feel you need in order to be happy? Who or what do you measure yourself against? But then he gets into the story of Trevor Lawrence, the quarterback for the Jacksonville Jaguars, and formerly the quarterback for the Clemson Tigers. I forget.
Yes.
He was a very, very successful college quarterback.
I know it's Clemson. I don't know about the Tigers piece.
Okay. Yeah. He was an insanely good quarterback. He gets to the NFL and he's drafted by a terrible team. And they made the playoffs last year, which was kind of cool to see, but they were bad for a while. And so this like high draft pick quarterback, I don't know if he was pick number 1 or not. I think maybe he was. So a top pick in the draft, or one of the top picks in the draft, goes to this bad team. And you're used to hearing people be like, oh yeah, well, I'm going to do everything I can to turn this around. I'm not going to sleep until we reach the playoffs and we're winning a Super Bowl and yada, yada, yada. And the sports commentators were kind of beating up Trevor Lawrence because he was basically saying that I love football. I'm going to give it my best, but if things don't work out the way I want them to, it's not going to define me. They didn't know what to do with that.
Well, they knew what to do with it, which was just drive him into the ground for it, because he wasn't obsessed. Like that's the kicker here. Like he wasn't so obsessed with football that it defined his entire being. That was the problem in the whole situation. But he's got an awesome mentality there, right? He's able to realize that his entire identity is not wrapped up in football, which is great because at some point you can't play football anymore. At some point, you have to retire from football. I don't know many 80-year-olds who are playing football. At some point, you have to retire. So if you do that, think of like all the heartache that a lot of pro sports players have when they retire. How many times do these superstars retire and then come back when they have their entire identity wrapped up in that sport and then step away from it? Well, what do they have left to do? Well, he's got a great mentality there. It's like, well, he'll just do something else. So it's cool to see, but again, the media doesn't know what to do with that. Like, he's super healthy. Well, we only want unhealthy pro sports players. Like, it's like that's really all we want. We want people who have an unhealthy relationship and just work constantly. That's what we actually want.
Yeah, we want people who are obsessive, and that's kind of the point. Is he talks about obsessive versus harmonious passion, and obsessive passion is highly impulsive. It's fueled by emotions and unresolved internal conflict. It's regularly associated with addiction, correlated with low self-esteem. Like, you don't want to be in that camp, right? But harmonious is healthy intrinsic motivation. You control your passion instead of your passion controlling you. But that's not the narrative that the world wants to hear. One of the things that they talk about in this chapter, which I really appreciated, that story about Trevor Lawrence, and I felt like it illustrated, was that when you are in the gap, you are desperate to get there because you're trying to escape being here. And that phrasing resonated with me because I can see how I slip into that sometimes. I'm definitely susceptible to that. And I don't want to be. So there's definitely room for growth having gone through this book. But related to that is another key idea here called the two types of freedom, which is really, really powerful. The first type is freedom from, which is external, objective. You're not a slave, that kind of thing. I don't have to do this thing anymore. But then there's freedom to, which is internal, subjective. You're your own master. You get to do something else. And that's kind of what Trevor Lawrence is talking about. He's like, I get to play football, and that's great. I'm going to do my best to be the best that I can be. But ultimately, whatever that best is, I'm good with. I'll know that I gave it my best shot, and I will be completely satisfied when it is time to move on to something else, because he recognizes that he has the freedom to make that transition when he wants to. You definitely see people who are just kind of holding on, right? And maybe they hold on longer than they should,
right?
Because they have trouble letting go. They have trouble embracing a different identity. So I think there's a lot of different applications of this, but obviously one of them would be transitioning between major life stages.
The two different freedoms are interesting to me. Like, you really don't think about, like, I have the freedom to do something, but you also have the freedom from something. Right? So it's the difference between being a slave and a master, as he uses here. It's just an interesting concept to me because I don't usually think in those terms. Like, I can't say that I've really thought about, I have the freedom to run a soundboard the way I want to run it. I'm not free from something. I just, like, I have the autonomy to be able to do that. Now, that's a bad example because I don't know many soundboards or people who are dictated to use a thing like that in a certain way. But I think you get my point. Like, I just don't think I really have processed that at a deep level. So there's some action items later on we'll talk about that I think will maybe help me with that to some degree. But this is like getting into the territory where, like, again, I haven't really thought through that terminology. So this goes back to that whole blog post concept, right? This is starting to put some meat on the bones for the gap side of this in a way that, like, I haven't processed it this way. So yes, I understand the gap, but now you're starting to give me a little bit more around that. So again, I'm grateful for that.
All right. Well, let's go into chapter 2, which is be self-determined. And by the way, all these chapters have like subheadings as well. So this one is define your own success criteria. And it starts with a story about public education, which was invented in 1918 to get kids out of factories. I'm kind of paraphrasing his words, so if that's factually incorrect, I apologize. Obviously, you and I both homeschool, so people know our thoughts on this already. But the big point he's making here is that it wasn't to train kids to become leaders and creative thinkers. It was an investment in our collective economic future. And this whole structure or system teaches our kids to measure themselves against an external reference point. Just think of like all the standardized tests that you can take and the scores that you get and the percentiles. Like, I totally see the evidence of this. And I think you and I probably at some level have internalized this already. Maybe this added some more context, some more color, some more detail. But one of our goals as a family with homeschooling our kids was that we wanted our kids to become lifelong learners. We wanted them to love the process of learning, because I recognized with my internet career and the things that I've done online creatively that I started off not good at any of these things, but I was smart enough to put something out there, learn from it, and do it better next time. In fact, one of the first things that got me into screencasting, I don't know if I've ever told you this story. When I was first starting to talk to Tan at Asian Efficiency, I had seen some of David Sparks' screencasts. I think he had just done like the whole OmniFocus series at that point. And I was like, wow, these are really cool. I'm going to try to make one. And I recorded one on Text Expander, and it was terrible.
It's easy to do a bad screencast. It really is.
It was awful. I did it sitting on my couch one afternoon. It was 15 minutes of rambling. I didn't really show anything. Like, I made every mistake in the book, but I published it to a now defunct YouTube channel called Semi Pro Workflows. It was the only one that I had ever published, and I don't even think I ever made it public. But somehow Tan found it, and we were talking, and he's like, hey, I like the screencast stuff you do. And I was like, what are you talking about? He's like, the Semi Pro Workflow stuff. I'm like, oh my gosh, you found that? I'm so ashamed. But he's like, he was able to see the potential there. And he's like, no, this is pretty good. I think you could be pretty good at this. And so I kind of accidentally published the first one. And that was by far the hardest one and the most embarrassing. Right. But then I was able to learn from that and iterate on it. And now I'd like to think that I've gotten pretty good at it. But that iterative cycle, if I had not, I could see if I was in this environment that he's describing with public education. And I think once you get into the workforce, there's the same sort of tendency to compare what you're doing with other people who are doing certain things, and that can keep you from ever trying anything. If I had recognized that sort of situation was there, I probably never would have done it. However, that was the thing that kind of catapulted me into this whole creative cycle. So it doesn't take a lot to get it going, and that's really what we want to teach our kids. Create, not consume. That's a big part of it, right? So we're not saying you can't use the technology, but use it with a purpose. Don't just go through the endless feeds. Don't just consume the stuff. Determine for yourself what success looks like with these different tools, different platforms, etc. And I've got a couple different action items associated with this. The first one is to list 10 things for I know I'm being successful when. And this is not associated with an outcome. That's why it's like this is why it's specifically worded. It's not I know I'm successful when. It's I know I'm being successful when. So it's the conditions present tense that have to be satisfied in order for me to, okay, yeah, I'm doing the right things. I'm not associating it with an outcome. And then the other one is to come up with my own filtering questions. There's a bunch that they use on page 45 about what you should be engaged with. And I love me some questions, but I want to identify my own questions. I don't want to use the ones that are necessarily provided for us in the book. But I guess that's one other thing I'll mention here is as he goes through this, there's 6 different chapters here, but he gives you lots of different questions and lots of different practical, like try this out, think through these questions, write down some things. If you're keeping a journal and you're following along at home, it's almost like a workbook. And I would encourage people to spend some time wrestling with this stuff, not just crank through the words like we did for this podcast.
That's a good point, because there are, like, you get to the end of these chapters and there are like chapter takeaways, but there's a lot of like time for a quick exercise. Pull out your journal and simplify the success criteria you've listed above. Like, and then he has questions for you to work through. And I didn't do hardly any of these, completely upfront about that right now, but I have a couple 3 action items here of these to do. I'm going to join you on this particular one. I'm being successful. I know I'm being successful when 1 through 10. What are those things? And that in itself, I think, is like the starting point for, if these things are happening, then I know I'm on the right path. And like some of those things, like sometimes I feel like it's helpful to like hear some of those examples. And some of these are like, I can wake up every day and ask, what would I like to do today? If my passive revenue exceeds my lifestyle needs, I can live anywhere in the world I choose. There are no whiny people in my life. I wear my watch for curiosity only. I can quit anytime. Like these are things that aren't necessarily like data driven. My brain tends to go there. It's like, when I have this much money per month, I know I'm being successful. It's like, no, that's not even remotely what he's getting at here. This is primarily like the non-tangibles, I guess, of day-to-day life. So like I feel like that can be very, very helpful. So I definitely want to do this one. So I'm joining you on this action item.
Nice. And it's not so much I've gotten to a certain point, I've got enough passive income and these conditions can be met. It's really the things that are tied to progress in that direction. Like there's a story in here which I really liked about the British rowing team. And they had not won a gold medal since 1912. But they won a gold medal in Sydney in 2000, I believe, by using a single sentence filter, which was just, will it make the boat go faster? And that's pretty brilliant when you think about it. I mean, when you're talking about like teams and organizations and empowering individuals, whether they be employees or volunteers, to really run with the vision, this is the kind of thing that you need. They don't need to know all the individual details and all the OKRs and all like the vivid vision and all that kind of stuff. They need to know what's the filtering criteria so that I can make the decisions on my own and apply the speed of implementation and move things forward without a whole lot of back and forth. And I love this story, but I need to figure out what is that single sentence filtering mechanism for me. So we mentioned the life theme cohort earlier. I have that life theme and I'm continuing to refine it as we go through that stuff. But each one of the weeks, I give people a whole bunch of clarifying questions, which I think are really valuable. The whole goal of the life theme cohort is to end up with the single sentence. But I like this as a separate version of that, I guess, is like a single question. Right. So yeah, the life theme, tying it to the life theme, that maybe answers the question of what we do. But then this question is almost like how we do it. And I love this approach. I like the idea of how do you say this? Ethemia, which is being on the right path and not being led astray. And he also mentions how living in the game is living by clear measurables that you've defined for yourself. So it kind of, for me, ties back to the daily questions that I do inside of Obsidian all the time. Did I do my best to move the needle in these particular areas? You know, I think there's a chance. I don't have an action item associated with this, but I want to continue to just kind of think on this. And I think this may influence some of that stuff a little bit. I think primarily I'm doing the right things, but maybe the flavor is going to change a little bit.
Before we started recording, I told you that I had 3 action items and I could only find 2 of them on my notes. This was the third one, was that filtering system, trying to get narrowed down to that single question. The trick here is that I'm not done with your life theme cohort, so I don't have that part nailed down here. So that might end up being a delayed action item here, but I'm going to at least write it down, start working towards that, because I feel like that would be crazy helpful. Like, should I get donuts this morning? I mean, the answer is yes, but how do I justify it with that question? So,
Sure. Well, you may not want to get donuts in the morning when you read through the next chapter.
see,
So
you just got to skip that one.
can't do that. Can't do that. You got to
Okay.
read the whole thing.
All right.
Sorry.
All right, fair enough.
But chapter 3 is the compound effect of the gap or the vein, gap or the gain. Train your brain to see the gains. I like that a lot. There's a lot of talk in this chapter about optimism and how being continually in the gap wears down your physical body. One of the studies that they shared in this chapter I really liked mentioned that optimistic people live on average 10 plus years longer than pessimistic people. And they tie that specifically to a study of the Sisters of Notre Dame, where they had 180 nuns who were all born before 1917 write autobiographical journal entries. And then the nuns whose entries contained overtly joyful content lived on average of 10 years longer. And by age 85, 90% of the happiest nuns were alive compared to 34% of the least happy nuns. And I mean, you could nitpick that study, I guess. There's only 180 people, but I think this is true. For a while, we were going into a local nursing home for a church ministry. Like once a month, we would just go visit with the residents there. We would sometimes play music, play games. One time the kids came and they brought their favorite storybooks. And so they sat with the residents and read their storybooks to them, done like Christmas caroling in the halls, stuff like that. And there are definitely people there who are, they don't want to be there. There are also people there who are just, they don't really care. They're living their best life. There was one guy I remember who his name was Carl. He was an Army veteran, and every time that we came, he would like get on the intercom and make the announcement. He like prided himself on being the guy, you know, who was announcing all the social happenings, and he just loved it when we came in there, you know, and he was our best buddy. And there were a couple other people like that really they stick out in my mind, but there are also other people there who obviously they're upset at their circumstances. Their family members aren't around, or even if they are, they're not coming to visit, and they just get real negative and bitter. I think I mentioned this at one point, but there's a book that I read as a gap book a long time ago called 30 Lessons for Living, which is a really, really great book. And basically, it was by Dr. Carl Pillemer, and he went into all these nursing homes and found these people who are just, they're full of joy, they're having a ton of fun, and interviewed like 10,000 of them about, you know, what's the secret to your happiness. And I definitely think there's something to this idea. And the pessimistic response to this, I guess, would be, well, you can't just choose to be happy all the time. And he's kind of saying, yeah, you can.
Which is frustrating, to be quite frank, because it means that if this is like going back to like a handful of the last few books. Like if it's not going well, I don't like where it's going. It's in my brain. And I don't like being told that it's my fault that I'm unhappy about something. But it's absolutely true, and it's absolutely something that I need to work on. Like, and obviously, like, I feel like this is something that I need to definitely work on because it keeps like beating me over the head here recently. Like, Joe, have you got this through your thick skull yet? This is in your brain. Like, quitting frustrated by these things. Like, quit it. So I I kind of want to blame you for the books that you're picking for this particular feeling. So thanks for that, Mike. But I also know that this is my own doing as well. So yeah, I don't really have an action item with this one because I'm not really sure how I would write it down or what it would be tangibly, however you say that. Wouldn't be tangible. But I do know that like this is one thing that I need to continue to work on. So maybe this is the thing, is trying to like get this to where I'm noticing when I'm going down one path mentally versus the other. So maybe I'm getting there, but continuing to read books that tell me to get my head in the right place is helpful too, because it keeps pounding me over the skull with it, which is a good thing.
Well, this one is interesting because it doesn't say get your head in the right place, but it basically paints a picture of, okay, there's two options and this one's good and this one's not so good. So choose the good one.
Yes, which is the same as telling me get your head in the game.
Yeah, it's less abrasive, I feel. But yes, like he does talk about in this section how comparison makes you unhappy. The gap robs you of enjoying what you have. It's a really powerful idea here about changing the context and changing the meaning, because the pushback with what you were just sharing was, well, so I'm just supposed to pretend that this bad stuff didn't happen to me. And not exactly, but sort of. You don't have to attach, like, you don't have to stay attached to the negativity of those situations. Later on in the second half of the book, he talks about this experience transformer, where you take what happened and you kind of spin it and you use it for good. And I think one of the things he says in this chapter that highlights the pushback to this is that people with low emotional intelligence, I love that topic, emotional intelligence, obviously, but people with low emotional intelligence are highly sensitive to fairness violations. So if you find yourself saying that's not fair, in his words, maybe you have low emotional intelligence.
Hmm.
And again, like that could be heard the wrong way and be like, oh, well, you're telling me that I'm not skilled or you're better than I am. No, no, because emotional intelligence, you have the ability to develop that. It's not something that you're just born with. It's not talent. It's not innate ability. It's something that if you embrace a growth mindset, you can develop and you can become a better version of yourself. One of the best stories in this whole book, by the way, comes from this chapter, the Principia College women's
Yes.
soccer team.
This is what I was just getting ready to bring up. Like, this is gold.
Well, I'll let you talk about it if you want.
So this is 1984 to 1988. Kim Butler was a college soccer player at Principia College. Principia? And they were not doing well. They were doing very poorly. And the coach decided that once they got on the bus to drive back, they had an hour or two back after games. There weren't locker rooms, so they didn't do a debrief after the game. They just went straight from the field onto the bus. And the coach would start a 5-minute timer. And they were allowed 5 minutes. Again, this is the beginning of the game, beginning of the season. They were doing very poorly. They were allowed 5 minutes to sulk. In other words, they were given 5 minutes to just be upset about how the game went. And then the coach would set a 10-minute timer, and they had to collectively talk about good things that happened during the game. And then they would set another 20-minute timer, and every player had to point out one specific good thing that another player did during that game. In other words, they were given 5 minutes to sulk over this, and then they were forced for 30 minutes to focus on the positives. This is exactly what he's referring to here. It's like you're allowed 5 minutes in this gap territory, which I can appreciate that he's willing to admit that we're not all superhuman and we can't just force our brains to step away from it. But if you allow yourself a short amount of time in that, it's literally set a timer. I would totally have to set a timer. And then flip the script and go into the gratitude practice and noticing the things that were improvements or that went really well and flipping the script and either like just externalizing those in some way, whether it's writing them, whether it's talking to somebody about it in some form. Doing that can change your attitude about it. So you're not like you were saying, Mike, like it's not you're not playing pretend. Like we're not getting the dollhouse out here and building some stick figure thing that is fake and we're just going to pretend that everything is happy go lucky. No, that's not the case at all. You're actually putting yourself in a different mindset so that you can focus on those gains and so that you can focus on the positive side of it. That type of thing is the sort of thing I need to hear. So thank you for that, team.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on in that format there, but the main point that he's making there is that didn't allow them to stay in the gap for very long. And the beginning of that story, he talks about how they were pretty terrible. A lot of them had never played soccer before. In the first half of the season, they lost every game. The second half of the season, they won every game, and they ended up winning the Division II NCAA championship.
Yes,
which is kind of crazy to think about.
That's absolutely nuts. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't think it's far-fetched. I think this is a really, really powerful idea. The problem is, speaking for myself, I tend to get stuck in that gap, right? And I continue to brew on what went wrong. I could benefit a lot from just setting the 5-minute timer and like, okay, let's turn the page. And for whatever reason, it's easier for me to see this in other people. Like when I was coaching the middle school soccer and basketball teams, I told my kids this all the time. Like when they had a rough game, you're like, okay, so you've got 5 minutes to be upset about that one. Then we turn the page and we don't talk about it ever again. We move forward. But yeah, there's the switching from the gap to the game. There's the bonding with the teammates by calling out the things that other people did well. That positive focus, that's another thing Dan Sullivan talks a lot about, just from the different things that I've read and heard from him. In fact, at the day job, we tried to begin and end every single meeting with a positive focus. So the beginning of the meeting, you're calling out and sharing the good news, right? And then at the end of the meeting, we're sharing gratitude. So in the middle of the meeting, we're arguing, we're fighting, we're pushing to get our way, right? But we're talking about ideas, not people. And then we always wrap it up cleanly at the end. I think this is a very generalizable approach for any sort of team. The other thing I want to mention here with the calling out something good that you saw someone else do, we've embraced this in our family before. Got 5 kids, and that means that every seat in the Suburban is filled, which means on long road trips, sometimes tempers flare a little bit. And I remember one time being in the car, people were fighting, and I was like, all right, that's it. Now everyone is going to share one thing that they appreciate about Malachi. No one wants to do it at first, but after they start, you gain a little bit of momentum. All right, now share one thing that you appreciate about Jonathan. 15 minutes later, it's completely changed the atmosphere in the car. So I have a little bit of experience with this, and I can confirm it definitely works.
I took a different approach about a year ago. All my kids were in the back and they were fighting, and this was in January in Minnesota, so not exactly warm outside, and they were just on each other. And I told them, it's like, fine, you need to cool off. And I rolled down all the windows in the back. We're doing 65 down the road. Like it's freezing. I want to say it was like 5 degrees outside. It's like, you guys need to cool off. It's like, I left the windows for exactly 60 seconds and then rolled them back. It's like, okay, are we all settled now? We all good? Like, okay, they were fine after that. So you just need to cool off a bit. It's like, literally. Your approach is probably significantly better at life lessons than mine, but it works.
Hey, whatever works. All right, let's go into the next part. So part 2 is get into the gain, and chapter 4 is always measure backwards. And That is kind of exactly what it says on the tin. I think the second half of this book is going to go significantly faster because some of this stuff has
Yeah.
been discussed already. But the big thing here is that progress is everything. I like the idea that they talk about in with the inattention blindness, which is you're being so fixated on one thing that you fail to see anything else. Definitely see how that applies to me. But then the big section here is talking about journaling and questions for journaling, which these are good. I'm not going to use these. I've got my personal retreat framework actually instead. So where am I right now? What are my wins from the last 90 days? What are my desired wins for the next 90 days? Where will I be in 12 months? Where will I be in 3 years? Basic idea is the same, but I'm not gonna apply these questions. There's one other idea here which is worth unpacking. That's this 4 levels of competence by William Howell. You start off with unconscious incompetence. You have no idea what you don't know. And then you get into conscious incompetence. You recognize what you don't know or your lack of skill. And then conscious competence, where if you apply yourself, you realize that you can do a thing. And then unconscious competence is kind of the highest level. And that's where it just becomes automatic. And that's really what we're striving for. That's what we're moving towards when we embrace this whole model. But we can forget about the progress that we've made, especially once we get to that top level, without taking the time to look backwards, which is the big idea here. Always measure backwards because that's where you can see your growth.
The journaling piece here is the part that caught me the most. He kind of got into this whole, I think this was the section where he was talking about the last hour of your day is the most important because you're like wrapping up your current day and preparing for the next. And like I have an on again, off again relationship with journaling, and I do it maybe a couple times a week right now. After reading this, I'm starting to realize like that's a really good way to keep an eye on, am I focusing on the distance between where I'm at right now and where I feel like I should be or want to be, need to be, and or am I focusing on where I'm at right now versus where was like a week ago or even yesterday or earlier in the day? Like those are things that I want to try to keep an eye on. So I just wrote it as get consistent with my evening journaling. Like I already have, I'm similar to you. I don't have like these questions. I don't really want to follow those. I kind of have my own process for that. So I'm going to follow my own. I just want to get more consistent with it. I just feel like that would be super helpful, especially after reading this. So that's the one piece from this chapter I took away.
Well, actually, I think you're starting to get into the next chapter.
Is that where it was?
Let's actually go there. Yeah. So chapter 5 is measure 3 wins daily. But this is where he talks about the research about the people who use their phones before bed.
Oh, right.
And so he kind of introduces it in the previous chapter with the concept of journaling, but the specific, like the most valuable hour of your day part, that comes from this chapter, I believe.
Yeah. So no, you're right. I'm flipping through it right now. You are absolutely correct. I just got ahead in my notes apparently.
Well, that's okay. I mean, it all kind of blends together here in the second half of the book. The first thing he says in this section is that your behaviors before bed are coded into your long-term memory. And he talks about how reactivity breeds more reactivity, which is kind of what you were talking about, breaking that cycle. And I had kind of the same thought. There's some startling statistics in here, by the way. 96.9% of people use their phones the hour before bed, which I fall into that occasionally, but 90.8% use their phones in bed right before they fall asleep. And that seems ridiculous to me, but I don't know. I guess I can see that. Now, I don't do that, but I do fall into the larger group of using it the hour before bed. Frequently, I forget to do Spanish until I'm about ready to head to bed, and that's when I have to use my phone. Occasionally, I'll do some journaling stuff on there too, because I'm already using my phone for Spanish. So this has got me thinking about my bedtime routine. And I want to figure out a way to do Spanish earlier so that when I am getting ready for bed, I do not have to touch my phone. Now, I do digital journaling. So, how am I going to do that? Typically, that happens at the end of my day. Well, I've got the Onyx books, but I've kind of slipped in just craziness with the last several weeks. I have not been using it for journaling at the end of the day consistently. I feel like I've been running around like a chicken with my head cut off. Um, so I know that it's got to change, and this I think could go a long way in towards helping me feel more balanced and more centered. Um, Another thing associated with this and the habit of journaling, this is a separate action item for me, but I want to get consistent with the gratitude journaling. So that's kind of the whole package, or the process that they're describing in this chapter, is that you want to measure your 3 wins every day. So it's very specific. You should journal your 3 wins. You should pick 3 things that you want to work on for tomorrow or at the beginning of the day. And I don't like getting that specific with it. But this really did speak to me. It talked about like shared a quote from Thomas Edison: "Never go to bed without a request of your subconscious." I feel like by using the phone before bed, I kind of just throw the possibility of that out the window. Whereas if I can see how if I really went all in with this journaling practice, that would produce some of that stuff where it's like, well, let's continue to think on that. And even after I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to leave that until tomorrow, having that in your subconscious, I can see the value of that approach. That's definitely something that I want to do as well.
I have a bad habit of I'll crawl into bed and then I'll pull my phone out to check on. I've I've played on and off on chess.com for a while now, and I'll pull out my phone and play like some of the daily games that I've got going on and just like make my one move for the day on 2 or 3 games, and I'll do that while I'm in bed, and then maybe read an article I've saved to a reading list, and then put the phone away and roll over and try to go to sleep. So like I'm absolutely in this category. Like, okay, this is not good. So I really shouldn't do this. I didn't write this as an action item. I probably should. I'll do this. I'm going to add an action item here. So I'll take the action item. I need to stop doing that. Just put the phone away. I know this. These are things I know. How many times have we read books about this? How many times have I picked books about this? And yet here I am in the same boat again.
Yeah, it's not a knowledge problem, which is why this whole idea of the gap and the gain I feel is so powerful, because that perspective can create the motivation to follow through with some of these things that we know we should do, but we have trouble doing them. Uh, Another thing in this chapter that's kind of talked about is this whole idea of like how you end the day and how you start the day. So you don't want to be reacting all the time. You want to be intentional, want to hit the ground running. And they introduced this concept of Pearson's law, which is that when performance is measured, performance improves. And when performance is measured and reported back, the rate of improvement accelerates. And this in this chapter kind of speaks to me about um, the daily journaling stuff and like the daily questions, which I mentioned earlier. This kind of solidifies why this approach is important to me, because it's a way of measuring that performance, but not in a way where you're focused on the gap. I feel like when you focus on the outcomes, and I did this and I accomplished this, that kind of reinforces the gap thinking. But the gain is, I don't know, like the daily questions talked about in Triggers by Marshall Goldsmith really feels like a very complementary idea of staying in the gain. So I tend to continue to do that.
I'm with you.
All right. The last official chapter here is chapter 6, and that is transform every experience into a gain. Big idea in this chapter is that meaning and value are not given to us, we create them. That's kind of a powerful idea. And when you frame an experience in the gap, you lose the power and the ownership over it. Kind of talks about how even traumatic experiences can be changed and that your past isn't fixed, but it's flexible. I guess what do you think about that idea?
I don't like it because, again, it means that it's my fault. So it's in this chapter, he goes through a lot of like transforming your viewpoint on things. Like he starts with a story of like a guy who's trying to invest and he thinks he needs $5 million in the bank in order to feel financially secure. But then once he gets to like 7, he's like, well, I actually think it should be like 10. And then he's all of a sudden at 17, but he still feels like he doesn't quite have enough. It's like, dude, you're 3 times over what you felt like you needed. But it's exactly this. Like he's found his meaning in like a bigger number. It's like the Rockefeller thing. I don't even know if it's a real deal. It's like how much is enough money, and he's at $1 more. Like I don't know if he actually said that or if somebody's just made this up at this point. But that concept is exactly what we're talking about here. It's like that gap thing that's always moving. But the whole like life and meaning and you creating it for yourself, like I don't really have arguments against that, but I also know that trying to do that and to get yourself trained to think that way, if you're not like wired that way, I don't want to say from birth because I know that it's more like a training thing, but if you've not been taught that from early on, like it's tough to switch your mindset from one side to the other on that one. So it's a continual battle, at least for me, I find that is. So yes, one that I don't like, but I also like because it means I have control over it, but it also means that I'm bad at it, Mike.
Well, I think I'm bad at it too. Um, this whole idea of the experience transformer, I know this is from Strategic Coach, and I want to try and find this resource and give this a shot. However, I think I've seen this before, and my recollection of it was powerful idea, but too complicated in the tool. So I think there's an 80/20 with this, which is recognizing that you have the ability to interpret things different ways. Facts don't necessarily equal truth, right? Going back to liminal thinking by Dave Gray. And I want to try and I want to try and apply this. I want to be, I guess, more psychologically flexible is kind of how he talks about it. Because psychological flexibility basically means that you can manage your emotions, they don't manage you. So you don't really mind what happens. And that leads to less anxiety and depression. He also talks about how successful people don't control events, but they control their response to those events. And so that's challenging to me. I think I can do a better job with that. So I have an action item here for finding that experience transformer and giving it a shot, but I am not that confident that the actual tool is going to stick with me.
This is similar to the whole it's not my fault, but it's my responsibility territory as well. It's also in the territory of I'm not how do I say this? I'm not sorry for the actions I've taken, but I'm sorry for your response to them. Like it starts to fit into that territory. You know what I mean? Like it's not necessarily I don't have to get all bent out of shape because somebody else did something. I can't control what they did, but I can control my reaction to it. And I know like I've had a couple of crazy days. Mike has been very gracious in moving Bookworm recording times around for me, but like I've just had some stuff at work that's out of my control, and I could get really bent out of shape on it. Last Friday, I was kind of hot under the collar, but I made sure I didn't talk to anybody because I knew I was hot under the collar and I was going to say something inappropriate. So I didn't speak. I just chose not to say words. Like, just tell me what needs done. I'll do what I can to get it done. And that has served me very well in this particular scenario, because then I know that like I still have those relationships fully intact. I didn't, it didn't lead to anything. But that means that like you have to be willing to control your actions in those scenarios. But again, I can't control what they do. They may have stepped out of bounds, and I feel like they're definitely in the wrong. And since then, I've made sure we've had a calm conversation about it. They're aware of my feelings on it. They realize what they did now. And I think we're in a better spot overall. But it just means that in the moment, trying to keep a cool head, maybe I should have rolled the windows down. That wouldn't have worked today. But that is just something like I need to make sure that I know that I can control my reaction, but I can't necessarily control the circumstances. That's not simple to do. In that particular scenario, I know like I've had some practice in that particular one, but in general speaking, I'm not very good at this. Like there are definitely a lot of areas in this specific arena that I know I need to work on.
Well, you and me both, but I think it's really important that you try to, the collective you, we, all of us together, try to transform these experiences, because in the words of Dr. Benjamin Hardy and Dan Sullivan, they say that when you don't transform your experiences and avoid them instead, which is the other option there, right? You could just continue to be upset about the thing that happened.
Yeah.
Then you experience intrusive rumination. I've definitely been in that place before. But even more importantly, or more powerfully in my mind, I guess, is that I've seen other people who are close to me get stuck in that. And I don't want to do that. Again, it's probably easier to see in somebody else than it is in yourself, but ultimately you have to take control over yourself. That's really the only thing you've got jurisdiction over. But I have a very vivid picture of some experience that hasn't been transformed, and how it just ate away at people close to me, and I could see the effect that it was having on them. And it, that the person who wronged them, they completely forgot about it. They moved on. There was nothing, no additional interaction, but it just continued to eat at the people who just refused to let it go. And it's not even letting it go. That's not the thing. It's not pretending that it didn't happen, but it's like, okay, so what good can I glean from this or glean from this? And then I'm willing to just dismiss it, right? I'm not going to stay there. It's like, as long as you hold on to it, Bible would say you retain the sins of others onto yourself, right? By refusing to forgive and move on from that situation. I think that's really dangerous. And the season of life that I'm in, like going into my first day officially full-time independent creator guy, right? I got to be careful, because I don't want to let anything steal or sabotage my future. I kind of don't even really know exactly what it's going to look like at this point, kind of figuring this out as we go, which is both exciting and terrifying to me. But I guess just hearing him talk about this in this chapter reminded me of the importance of this, not to get stuck there. And the picture I got in my head, like the fear setting worst case scenario, was my first week being independent. Something happens and I get offended, and I just let that thing eat me up for the next 6 months, and I make absolutely no progress. That's the situation I want to avoid.
But that's the trick, right? Is knowing when that sort of thing has happened and when to move on with that. I know like my boss is really good at this. He deals with all sorts of church political stuff and people who think things should be done a certain way or a different way. And it's like, that's not really our church. Like, he deals with that constantly. And I know there are many people that he just doesn't want to talk to because he knows he's just going to get complaints from them all the time. But he always greets them with a smile. He always is willing to talk to them. He doesn't let it get under his skin. It's like, well, maybe they'll eventually understand the overarching situation instead of focusing on this one little tiny thing that doesn't really apply. So like I can appreciate his viewpoint on that. It's not one that I feel like I have fully adopted, but it's one that I know that I could learn from. Like, okay, this is a person that I know that I regularly have issues with. That doesn't mean I need to treat them significantly different in this arena that I'm referring to. There are sometimes you need to, but the one that I'm referring to, no, it doesn't warrant that. So definitely something I need to learn as well. How many times have I said that this episode? I didn't write them down. Please don't count them. Okay. Thanks,
Lots of
team.
learning happening this episode, feels like.
Yep.
All right. So there's one last chapter here, and that is a very brief conclusion where a lot of the big ideas in this book are reiterated. I didn't write down a whole lot. The big thing that kind of stood out to me as I went through this conclusion is that ideals are like the horizon. You will never get there. He reiterates that measuring backwards liberates you from the gap, encourages us to make the choice to be happy, and reminds us that we train our brain on what to see. He also shares a whole long list of all of the failures and the times where he's slipped into the gap, which is kind of it's very motivating to hear him describe it, because measuring backwards, you can see how like the first what seemed like insurmountable obstacles that he encountered, obviously you can see now like how he's gotten to that point, but all these points just kind of build on each other. So I think the effect of that, you can tell me if you viewed this the same way, was that you kind of see how he started at nothing. In fact, he shares how like at one point he was living on his staying at on his cousin's couch or something and playing Warcraft 15 hours a day.
Yes.
And it's kind of hard to see like, really the same guy was that guy?
Yeah.
But in this last conclusion, he kind of chronicles every step of that journey and the failures and rejections that happened along the way and how he transformed those experiences. And it just kind of encourages you that like you can do it too.
I had a hard time accepting that that was a true story. Like, there's no way. But yes way. He totally did. I totally believe him. I didn't write anything down on this chapter, but I know that like those particular, here's where I've struggled with this in the past. It shows that, so many times you read articles online, especially people in the productivity space, and they like paint this picture of here's this grand way of doing your project management or your task management. And it just seems like they've got it all put together. I know I've been guilty of this too. I know it comes across that way sometimes. But sometimes people are writing these things because they know it's the right way to do it. They just can't always bring themselves to do it every single time. And this is exactly what he's dispelling, in that he knows that this is a thing that exists. This is absolutely a better way to think about things by focusing on the gain versus the gap. But it doesn't mean that once you understand that, you've just magically flipped the switch, and every time you've looked down on yourself for the things you haven't yet accomplished, you can just magically not have that anymore. That's not the case. The man who is responsible for the idea and the guy who's responsible for this book, they know this is difficult, and here's how difficult it can be. So he's like putting some real world, even when you know all of this, it can still get you. You just have to recognize it. That to me is very refreshing and motivating, and I'm very, very grateful that they put that in there.
Awesome. Well, that's the official end of the book. Should we go to action items?
Yep. This one may take a while.
Yeah. So I've got a bunch which I'll run through, but I did not get a chance to write down your third one, so I only see the two for you in here. If you can grab that.
I got them though.
Okay, cool. So my first one, make my list of 10 things for I know I'm being successful when, way back from that first section. come up with my own filtering questions like the ones on page 45. I want to teach my family to call each other out when in the gap. I don't know exactly how I'm going to do this yet because I feel like you got to do this the right way. But I want this to become a thing at our house that we recognize this in each other and call each other out when we see it. I mentioned the no phone the hour before bed. I want to use the books instead, which some people may argue that's still a screen. It's an e-ink screen. It's not the same, but I'm going to use this very intentionally, and it's going to require me to shift some things around so that I can intentionally avoid my phone specifically. That's the big win. I want to get consistent with the gratitude journaling, and I want to find that experience transformer online and give it a shot. What about you?
I have the 4. 2 of mine are replications of yours. One was to do the I know I'm being successful when, those 10 things list. The second was to come up with my own filtering questions. Questions? We'll see where that lands. The other was consistency with my evening journaling. And then the last one was to stop playing chess in bed before I go to sleep. Man, that's hard to say out loud.
It is.
Yep. Gonna be done with that one.
All right. Well, let's go to action items. I'm sorry, not action items. Style
Just
and rating.
That one, Mike.
Yes,
We're
style
further
and
down
rating.
on the outline.
I've got a single screen. I've got a backup microphone. It's been a tough tech day. Tough tech day for Mike.
It's true. Bootleg listeners will catch a lot of that in all its glory.
You want to see Mike be in the gap.
It's true. It's true.
Listen to the bootleg.
Yep.
So style and rating. This is a different type of book. It's not like a lot of the other books that we read, and that's both good and bad. Primarily good, I would say. But I don't think it's necessarily, that doesn't necessarily mean it's like a 5-star book or anything. Keep in mind who these two people are, the relationship that they have in creating this book. This is Dan Sullivan's idea, and he worked with Dr. Benjamin Hardy in order to write this book about his idea. Now, that sounds like something that could get lost in translation, or something where he's like, okay, here's the core idea. Now just add 300 pages, make it longer, boom, done. That's not the approach that they took. And for the dynamic here, I think that's the right approach. It's something like 170 pages. I don't know how many pages are just a single quote in the middle of a page, though. All those quotes are kind of supplementary quotes. They're not pulled from the content of the book itself. It's from conversations that Benjamin Hardy had with Dan Sullivan. So I think it's a really effective way for communicating about this concept. I think this concept is transformational. It definitely has the ability to completely change your life. However, just looking at the book itself, like, where do I think this actually belongs in terms of a rating? I think it's about a 4.0. The idea itself maybe is like a 5.0 idea. And this is something that, I've been talking about off and on for a long time. I'm very grateful and happy that we went through it together and had a conversation about it. There's definitely more meat in this book than some of the other things that I've heard about the gap in the gain previously. But I also don't think this measures up to some of the other 5.0 books that we've had. I don't know if that's just the way that it was packaged, or maybe this is like a really powerful idea, but the real power of it comes from applying it yourself, so it doesn't need a whole lot of explanation. I think the net result of that is that it feels more basic, more elementary. When you go through it, it feels very simple. And I don't think that necessarily means that it's not a killer idea. But I don't know. Like, I'm trying to think of some of the other 5.0 books that we've read. The one gold standard that always comes to mind is Man's Search for Meaning. I feel like this one doesn't have that kind of impact. Another one that comes to mind is Flow by Mihaly, or How to Read a Book. You know, I feel like the ideas that I took away from some of those books, which are in like the Bookworm Hall of Fame, the golden books, those feel weightier than this does. I feel like this is very approachable, and just about anybody can read this and get some immediate benefit from it. So I would recommend that everybody read it. But I also recognize that I want to be careful how I rate books like this going forward. I really want to protect those higher ratings for the ones that really do feel like world altering. And while this is a really cool idea, and I definitely talk about it a lot, it doesn't feel world altering to me. Maybe that's just because I've encapsulated this idea and just kind of, the idea of syntopical reading, like I've mixed it and mashed it up with a whole bunch of other things that we've read. I think there's a potential that you could come to this book and be like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Totally a 5-star book. I think it's also possible you could come into this, like we talked about at the beginning, completely miss the plot and be like, oh, this should have been a blog post. So I think the truth of the matter is somewhere in the middle. So I'm going to give it 4 stars.
I just want to say that from a style stance, they did really, really well with this. You come into a new chapter and you got a story that I've never heard before, and they detail it in a way that exactly tells what that particular chapter is trying to get across, and they don't have so many chapters here that it gets hard to put it all together. Like, you got 2 parts, you got 6 chapters and a conclusion. That's really all it needs. But again, you can get into that blog post territory. I don't think this is that, given the way that they came at this. So I don't see it in that territory. I think you're right. It's not a 5.0 book. Some of that is just because like the idea is really big, but it's not necessarily this is going to completely change your life in one day type of idea, but it could definitely change your life in a very short amount of time too. So I'm a little hesitant on that front. So I know it doesn't sit in the 5.0 territory. Does it sit in the 4 or 5 territory? It just doesn't quite feel quite right. So I think you're right on with the 4.0. So I'll join you there, just because it just, I don't know, it just kind of seems right. Sometimes you just kind of feel your way through these things. It's my take. Anyway, I really like the book. I've already recommended it to a couple people. I think it's one that a lot of people should read, especially if you find yourself struggling with your mindset on things. Like if you can't seem to figure out why you always feel down about your entrepreneurial adventures, well, you might just be thinking about it wrong. Like, I feel like this could really help you get your brain in the right spot with that. So I have recommended it directly to a couple people already. So I think a lot of people should pick this up. I don't know if I would say everybody though.
I think I agree with you. The other thing I'll add with this before we put it on the shelf is I really do recommend that people get this one on Audible, which sounds weird because I'm generally against the audiobooks. The best audiobooks for me are ones that I have read previously and I just want to rehear or re-listen to the book itself, or they're like the biographical books like Creativity Inc. I really liked that in Audible format. I guess fiction books too, but I don't really do fiction. So
I was just getting ready to say, wait a second.
I recognize that would be a good format for like stories, basically. But this one, having the additional material where they actually just start shooting the breeze in between the chapters, I feel like that adds a lot. So that is more valuable, I think, than the actual content in the the book sometimes.
Fair enough.
Because the book is very formal, but when you get somebody in an informal setting, I feel like the way that they say things sometimes speaks louder than what they're actually saying. So if you're looking for a good Audible candidate, this is one of those.
Fair enough.
All right. That being said, let's put this one on the shelf. What's next, Joe?
Up next is The Things You Can Only See When You Slow Down by Heyman Sunam. Because mindfulness is the thing we need to talk about. Because I'm not being very mindful right now. There you go. And I'm going to drag you along with me. This one's rated pretty high in the Amazon world. So I'm curious to see. Like, I see a lot of these, like, 50 books you need to read in the next 3 years, or 15 books to read this year. And I feel like this one keeps hitting, like, every list I see lately. So right now I want to know what the hype's all about, even though it's been around for a while, I think, if I remember correctly. And then what, Mike?
Well, just on that topic, I think this is a pretty cool timing for this book. I mean, we just talked about the gap in the game. There's definitely a mindfulness aspect to that. Headspace has been a sponsor of Bookworm the last several episodes, so I've been dabbling with that again. So I'm actually excited to get into that one. But after that, I am picking one from the Bookworm Club. Ward recommended Decoding Greatness by Ron Friedman. And so we're going to go through that one after your book on things that you can only see when you slow down.
Sounds good. But how about a Gap book, Mike? What you got?
I do have a Gap book. I'm reading right now, The Richest Man in Babylon by George Clason. This is kind of a classic book that I have heard recommended many, many times, and I have never actually read it. So I'm going through it right now.
There you go.
How about you?
I've been back into Tribe of Mentors lately. So Tim Ferriss's book. I told you this is going to keep coming up.
Yep.
And I'm not 25% of the way through it. So you may hear me talk about this for about the next year at this point. So there you go. Super fun.
All right. Well, thanks for listening, everyone. Thank you specifically to the Bookworm Club premium members. If you want to become a member, you can do so at club.bookworm.fm, and I think also at bookworm.fm/membership. $5 a month, $50 a year helps us keep the lights on here at Bookworm HQ and gets you a couple of perks. I do these mind map files for all of the books that we read, and those are all in the club, along with a pro feed, which is the same show minus the ads, and a bootleg feed, which Joe mentioned earlier. That basically is the moment that we go live, and so it has a little bit of extra stuff at the beginning and at the end of the episodes. Today's bootleg, you get to hear me be frustrated with my technology right before talking about the gap in the game. So it's a separate feed that's available inside the Bookworm Club once you subscribe. So if you want to support the show, we'd love to have you join us. Bookworm.fm/membership.
And if you're amazing and you read along with us, pick up The Things You Can Only See When You Slow Down. We'll read that one with you, cover that one with you in a couple weeks. I almost stop the recording every single time. And I know I'm not supposed to. Like, I reach over and there's a marker button and a stop button. And I really got to move that stop button. Stream Decks for the win, by the way.
Mine is at home, unfortunately.
They are cool. I need to buy another one for the other room, for the worship center. Found out I can automate our soundboard with it, actually.
That's pretty awesome.
It's dangerous, that's what it is. Cool. When are we recording again?
Hopefully not on a Monday.
I was going to say, this has been kind of rough. We were supposed to record on Thursday. Is that right?
Yep.
So then we're down into June 1st. Is that right?
Yes, that would work out perfect.
Yep, let's do that.
Alrighty.
Bookworm. What time?
Hey, speaking of calendars, do you use Google Calendar or do you use iCloud?
iCloud, because it's better.
Okay, well then you can't use Cron.
What's cron?
It's a calendar app specifically for Google Calendars by the makers of Notion, but it's a pretty cool app with a bunch of keyboard shortcuts. And it has the fantastical like ability of saying, here's all the blocks, and you can send a link and say, here, pick one.
Okay. I don't
So I've
ever
been
do that.
experimenting. I've been experimenting with it because I had issues with Fantastical and it's keeps going up in price. Someone was asking me the other day, you have any recommendations for alternatives? And really didn't, but came across Cron and it's I'm pretty happy with it, but
Yeah,
it's Google only, so
sure.
iCloud calendars are not going to
I
work.
do the iCloud thing because of Fantastical. It didn't like Google Calendar for me, and then it didn't like iCloud Calendar for me. I was like, fine, I'm done with you. And
Yep.
moved over to
Yep.
BusyCal, and I haven't really looked back since then. What time do you want to record? 2 o'clock? Noon? I don't even remember what we normally do anymore.
Man, I don't think it really matters. Either of those are fine. Just I would prefer not to do it in the morning.
Okay, I'm going to do 1 o'clock
Already.
just to be in the middle. I'm almost there. And I'll be done with this. Okay, got it. Yeah, June 1st. Got it. Okay, cool. Yeah, I've not used Cron. I've not really looked at much other than BusyCal, but I have a couple shared calendars. I import a couple web calendars. What do I do? I need to see events and reminders in the same view. And that's really my requirement. So that ends up putting it, because the shared calendars are in iCloud, so I operate on iCloud and reminders. But then that view of showing me like when do I have things scheduled task-wise for today intermixed with calendar events, that's gold. So trying to find something that does that is key. I know Fantastical does it, BusyCal does it. I wish the built-in calendar app would do it, but it doesn't. But I've not really tried much else. Not at least recently.
Gotcha.
Not in like the last year. It's about a year, not quite a year ago, 9 months or so ago that I made that switch to BusyCal.
Well, if you like keyboard shortcuts, Cron is pretty cool too. They've got tons of them.
It's CHR? KR.
CRON.
That's lame.
I agree.
Because you know the whole cron job thing.
Yes.
Totally lame. Just like, okay, did you see the new top level domain that they're coming out with that they're gonna let people use?
What's that?
So you're used to like .com, .org, .co, .fm. They're now gonna allow .zip, ZIP. Do you see the immediate problem with this?
Yep.
So if you have put a zip file on your site and linked to it, web browsers are going to have to figure out, is it a file or is it a website?
Oh boy.
So hopefully they could figure that one out. We'll see. So yeah, that may cause some angst for web developers here briefly until we can get figured out how to solve that one. Anyway, that's what that made me think of. Okay, cool. June 1st.
Sounds exciting.
Super fun.
June 1st it is.
Anything else we need to tell people before we go?
Nope. I will do a better job of getting the the events listed in the club.
Oh, did this one not make it?
Apologies for this one. I mentioned in the calendar event that I apparently forgot to push the button.
I didn't notice, but
So
I'll get you the link here shortly.
All right.
For the next one.
Thank you.
Sorry, people. This is about to be posted in the next 10 minutes. There we go.
Awesome.
Super fun. Cool. All right. Bye, all. Love you.